All right, seventh gear over at fans. Holy cow, have we got a special treat for you here today as we wrap up our series on the month of May Indy 500 specials. I could think of no better person to join us for this week's show as we also do our 500 preview and wrap up the qualifying. This guy is unbelievable. He has seen it, been there, done that. He probably has forgotten more about the Indianapolis Motor Speedway and specifically the Indy 500 than I'll ever know. And I know a fair amount. I take pride in that, but this guy is unbelievable. What you may not know about him is, he kind of started his broadcast career as a stringer for one of the local radio stations here in the Indianapolis area. He's raced Formula Fords. He served our country. He's actually, I think, even if I remember correctly, a certified trainer. He's an accomplished author, survived a helicopter crash. You know him as the voice of the Indianapolis 500 radio broadcast and for many, many, many years. And then the TV anchor for the ABC ESPN broadcast also for many, many years. He ranks right up there with the greats in Indianapolis 500 history, right there with Sid Collins, Tom Carnegie, you name it. Even Foyt, Andretti, Unser, and he's got stories about all these guys. So but I am more than grateful, honored to have this gentleman on the show with us today. I call him the great one, our new friend of the show, the one and only Mr. Paul Page. Paul, welcome to the Seventh Gear Over Rev show, my friend. How are you today?
I am well. Thank you for that introduction. That's Foyt, Andretti, definitely not, but thank you. Thank you very much.
You are more than welcome, my friend, more than welcome. And I know as we talked prior to hitting the record button here today, it's been a little bit of trying to connect here through social media. And so we are taking the time and Paul's been gracious enough with his time, even though we've both got commitments down at the Speedway this afternoon. But Paul, before we even get into your vast history and love of the Speedway and the 500, let's just kind of cover real quickly the qualifying for this last weekend. I'm sure you were watching it very intently, and it was, what were your thoughts on the qualifying this weekend, just from Saturday's general qualifying to the Fast 12 and the Fast 6 and the pole speed from yesterday?
Well, the thing that stood out for me on Saturday was that Andretti's operation couldn't do anything. I mean, Grosjean was the fastest of their cars. The others, Colton Herta and company, Rossi, they were nowhere, and that kind of surprised me. They'd had some fairly sufficient speedway test time, and the team is normally much better than that. So I don't know what they were doing, but whatever they did, it applied to several of their cars, and I thought that was interesting. The speeds, seeing VK do so well. I really like that kid. He is really a fun guy, and I love his dad. His dad and I text all the time. But
oh, that's awesome! Yeah, I met his mom and dad at St. Louis a couple seasons ago.
Aren't they cool?
They're really awesome. Cool. They really are.
Yeah. So, but Saturday, right now, with just 33 cars available, you're just going to find out, hey, where are they? But if we start getting the numbers that we used to have years ago, I mean, in my time, the entry number was like 106.
Right.
And maybe 20 of those weren't real. They just wanted, I think at that time, like 5 silver badges went with every entry. So it was cheaper for these guys to enter a car than it was to buy the badges.
Right.
They worked that way. Sunday, whoa. Man, how weird was the whole thing? The one thing that kind of got to me was what they did with Newgarden in qualifying, by letting him out. He withdrew a time. He was in the lane that you must withdraw your previous time and then go qualify again. And he had 2.5 laps, and it started raining, and his run was over, and it was done for the day. The rule they used is absolutely correct. They followed the rules, and they gave him his time back. I think that for guys like you and I who need excitement, that if they hadn't given it back and he had to start in the back, in my days of doing television, I would say, we're putting a camera on nothing but him, in addition to what else we're following, because he's going to stream up through the field. So I wish they'd kind of take a look at that. And but they, the officials, I'm really impressed with the folks that are doing it now. And so I assume that they had some good reason, but I'd really like to have seen it gone the other way. And then what's going on with Scott Dixon? I mean, 5 poles now. He's one less than Rick Mears. And he kind of disappeared the first part of the season. And then all of a sudden here he is with this incredibly blasting qualification in when they were doing the Fast Six, and sits on the pole. I mean, that's amazing.
It's
considering that there are
unbelievable.
all these other hot guys there that I mean, I would have thought that Paulo or Erickson or VK would have been the front row. But there's good old Scott. He puts it down when it's time to and set records doing it.
Well, and it's interesting too, because I was there most of the week last week, except for the day that got rained out. And, I remember Scott saying that he wasn't all that happy with his practice speeds.
Right. Yeah.
And, but then it's interesting because you mentioned how, the Andretti team didn't do well outside of Grosjean. It's like, and then you had Rossi withdraw his time and go backwards. And same thing with Penske. You've only had Will Power in the top 12, and those guys were kind of nowhere as well. Yeah. But then you've got Ganassi, and this kind of the joke with a couple of my other friends were like, they were very disciplined and very regimented. I think there was one day where TK and Pelot and Jimmy Johnson and maybe even Dixon went out together. They rolled the cars out of the garage area onto pit lane. They all came out. They all got in the cars. They all went out together. And it was like, wow, are these guys sandbagging? Because all of those Ganassi cars made the top 12, right? And now we've got almost a juggernaut of Penske in when he was really, the hot hand.
Right.
And holy smokes, these guys are a juggernaut. And to your point, Dixon throws out this massive speed, and it's like, holy smokes, and somebody even said Dixon was like maybe a little bit perturbed that, he's only won one Indy 500 so far, and that, he's got to make a statement to these young guys that he's not done yet.
Yeah, no. Yeah, so it all in all ended up being a great qualification weekend. And perhaps most of all, I loved the crowd. We actually had a crowd from really the old days. And it was so fun to see it. I even got in traffic trying to get out of there. And that was good too. I mean,
right.
Fast number of years, you just kind of drive out. But obviously, a lot of people have caught the Indy cars, and they want to be watching and want to be part of just being a viewer and a fan of Indy cars. And I think that's cool too.
I agree with you. And I think, race day, it'll be the first one in a couple of years now that we've had a full crowd back. I expect it to be, busting at the seams, and in those complaints that we have about being caught in traffic, I think we're all going to be happy with dealing with that race day.
I noticed maybe it had been done before, but when I was watching the Formula One from Spain, that they actually put up the attendance, and I think it was 278,000, but that was for the practice qualifying and the race itself. But I have a feeling that our 250,000-ish seats probably got their attention. And of course, who knows how many make it into the infield. I do know one morning I decided to stay overnight at the TV compound at ABC rather than fight some of the problems coming in. And I was up early, and I was up before the gun opening the speedway up for spectators. And I realized there were a whole bunch of people already in the stands. So I don't know how they got in, but I thought that was kind of neat too.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Yeah, that is pretty cool. But let me ask you this, Paul, because you've seen so much of this, especially on the IndyCar side. It seemed to me watching this, with as much from the TV broadcast, as much as those drivers were working the cars each lap between the weight jacker, the sway bars, the whole deal, the engine mapping. Is it just me, or does it seem like these drivers were working the controls more than I've ever seen in previous years? Did you feel that way?
No, absolutely. Absolutely. And I thought it was cool that last year the TV really started talking about the use of the anti-roll bars and everything. That was, I mean, I knew that was going on, but until I really decided to focus on one of the cockpit shots, I just, my goodness, look how often they're actually, I figure, okay, you set it for the turn, come out of the turn, set it for the straightaway. No, and I was really interested in some of the gearing combinations that they had, see who would go to 4 or 5, it was the whole, I like it that it's doing that. And it's putting the driver back in the element, I think, in what essentially is a spec car series. So it's something else to watch. And those guys are amazing that are doing that.
Yeah, and to see a couple of those guys, taking their right hand over to the left side of the wheel while they're going down the straightaway to make those changes, it's like, even Townsend Bell was making that comment during the broadcast yesterday. So, and then I think back especially with the big speed that Scott put up yesterday, thinking about, when we talked about the last big speed, Ari Leyendijk back in 96, right? It's like, okay, how much was Leyendijk working the controls and how many controls did he actually have to play with compared to now? And it's like, when you think about that.
I at that time, I believe, and I'll try to find Ari and confirm this because I've been thinking the same question. I think at that time your anti-roll and everything was pretty well preset. Yeah, you come into pits and change them, but I got a feeling that when he did it, that you didn't have it motorized in the way that you could cockpit control the thing. So,
right.
Right. Whatever. I'm a gearhead. I'm a total gearhead.
Same.
Anything like that. There we go. I love it.
Absolutely. And then I was thinking too, because I was sitting up in one of the suites visiting with some folks on Friday when we had
all those suites. I can't get into the suites.
I had a connection.
You got people.
I had some people. Right. But that was that crazy windy day. And I was blown away by hearing that Connor Daly's trap speed going into 3 was 243 miles an hour. I was like, holy smokes, I can't even wrap my head around that.
Well, it was a bit of a tailwind at that moment. So
yeah,
he got some help, but it was also so gusty. That part kind of scared me a little bit because the wind was gusting. It finally kind of settled down and was somewhat steady, but at least with the wings we have now, we don't have a big surface area at the back of the car that can push it out. But still, gusts on a car going 235, 36 miles an hour, that's something.
That's pretty nerve-wracking for the drivers. I have no doubt about that.
And for me, for the spectators, you too, huh?
Oh, I was sitting there, yesterday I was watching part of the broadcast and I was like a couple times, whether it was Grosjean coming close to the wall or Jimmy's big moment there, I was like, jumping out of my seat because I was like, I mean, the hair was raising up on my arms. I was like, holy smokes, these guys are really right on the ragged edge.
Yeah. You know what the broadcast was doing, because I tape and watch it after I get home. The broadcast kept showing either the flags behind the grandstand or the sock on top of the pylon. That's cool. That shows what it is. But they also take a measurement that I think comes from race control of what the speed is. And it's measured off an anemometer that's pretty high up. On the other hand, Firestone, who was really great, give me a lot of information this week, and they're always great that way. They measure down at track level, and it was just quite a bit of difference between what was going on, 100 feet up and what was going on at track level. Fortunately, the difference was that generally it was a little less than what you were seeing up on the top of the grandstands.
Right. Agreed. And I have to say too, while we're talking about this, I was not sure that I was going to be a huge fan of the new qualifying format for this year's race, but as it turned out, I loved it. I thought it was awesome. It created the drama that, we had hoped to have for a traditional bump day, for qualifying. And that really added a whole nother degree of drama to the equation, I thought.
Yeah, and I enjoy that too. I haven't yet tuned into the idea that you're not deciding the pole on the first day, but then I'm one of the guys that I'm a traditionalist, and to get me to change is a big deal. So I still think back to the days when we had 4 days of qualifying
and a whole month of May.
Yeah, and exactly, and why we called it the 30 Days of May.
Right.
And to see this new format, I really like it. And I think when we get a few more entries, it's going to be much more interesting.
Yes. Yes, because of course everybody wants to see more entries, and hopefully, the economics of all that work out to where there's more teams that can manage to do that. I know in talking with one of my engineer friends, he was saying, part of the problem with having only 33 in that 33rd car, the Stephen Wilson entry just
Right.
happened within the last couple of weeks, and it's mainly a manpower shortage. A lot of these guys that have been mechanics, they've been doing it for a long time. They know, as you do,
Right.
that it's long hours. It's a
Oh,
growing
it's a
pull of a
tough life.
schedule. And
Tough life.
yeah, and they finally, a lot of these guys have said, "Yeah, enough. I'm too old for this. It's time to move on." And
There is that one little fact, isn't there, about Wilson, that he's in the field without actually qualifying,
yeah,
and that's only the second time that that's ever happened. So there was that
right.
little note too.
Yeah, because he had those engine problems that they just couldn't
Yeah.
sort out on that first day.
Right.
So
Right.
wow, it's going to be a dramatic 500, I think,
Oh
with
yeah,
all
it
these
is.
all these big guns, further back in the field. And I'll ask you later on in the show here if you've got any personal favorites for the win. But if you don't mind, Paul, let's kind of go rewind here a little bit back in the as your career has gone on, because one of the things that I love, and I kind of feel like I'm a self-professed history geek when it comes to the 500. In fact, the first book report I ever wrote when I was a kid in grade school, I actually found a couple of months ago. It was a handwritten book, or a handwritten report on
Wow.
the Indy 500 from the only book that we had in our school's library. It was a yellow and black one. I might even have it somewhere on my books. Actually, I do, now that I think about it. I'll pull that out there to show you as one of my little
That's cool. That's
tidbits.
neat.
But and it was like, I think back to those days, and when I was listening to you on the radio as a little kid, as you took over from Sid, in those mid 70s, I used to sit there with a cassette player and a microphone in front of the AM FM radio, and I would record the entirety of the race
Really.
and then listen to it back later on. But talk about those early days. I mean, you got bit by the bug at the Speedway
Yeah,
early on. And
I was 15 years old in 1960, and I was actually ordered to go to the race. We were a military family, and we were stationed at Fort Sheridan, Illinois, which is up on the North Shore, just south of Lake Forest, actually. And my parents said, "You're going to the Indy 500 because your uncle would like to take you there." And my reaction was that I had, while we were stationed in Germany, I'd seen Formula One. So I'm a Formula One guy, And I even said, why do I want to go watch guys make 800 left-hand turns? And you're going. And the race hadn't started, just the ceremonies alone. And that was it. I was going to be there. I knew I had to do something that involved that. Everything about it just pulled me right in. Be a parts washer, which I actually was at one point or whatever, but I ended up on the broadcast side, and I was pretty lucky to get that.
well, and I know from even before I read your book, which is awesome. And for those of you that haven't bought it, it's called Hello, Paul. I'm Paul Page. It's Race Day in Indianapolis. It is a great book of many of Paul's interactions, his stories, his whole career in the broadcast industry, specific to the 500 and the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. But I know Sid Collins was a huge influence on your career, and talk a little bit about Sid for those of the listeners that don't know about that involvement, how you got involved with Sid and how you finally got to get that opportunity.
I was a newsie doing on the street reporting for WIBC radio, and Sid Collins was the sports director there. And when I got that job, I thought that's going to be cool just to see the man, watch the man work. Then one day I did an interview at the Soapbox Derby Hill, and you send it back to the station. Then I drove back, and Sid's standing in the hallway with his arms crossed, this kind of deal. And I'm like, oh. And he said, "That's the worst interview I've ever heard." I said, "Well, okay, there goes that career." But then he took me back in a studio, and he started to teach me how to interview. And that one thing led to another. I worked the 2 to 10 shift, and he had his sportscast at 7 on WIBC. So after that, if there was nothing going on, we'd just sit and talk. And I ended up with a doctorate in race broadcasting from him. He just, I can't tell you how subtle many of the things were that he taught. I give you an example of one subtlety. He would not only look for you for your repertorial skills, for your passion, for your dedication, but he also looked at how you sounded. Because as he told me, you don't want 5 guys out there who all sound the same. You want distinctive voices so that when that person speaks, you'll know who it is, even if they don't identify their location. You know, that's pretty subtle thinking. And I got a lot of that kind of information from him.
Wow. So it was kind of like he was kind of constantly rubbing on the genie bottle there to kind of not only polish it, but bring out the best in whoever it was, whether it was you or Lou Palmer or any of those guys back in the day.
Yeah. And Lou, by the way, worked the same shift that I did at that time. So, but Lou was in the newsroom reading a book or something all the time. He pretty well had it figured out. But yeah, and every time Sid would give me one of those lessons, he'd say, "Now there's no place on the network for you, but you know." And then in 1974, when they lengthened the pits, he said, "We're going to need another pit reporter. So here you go." And once I got into the pits for 74, 75, 76, I wanted out, because that was when there were no speed limits. I was in the north pit, so the furthest up, the fastest that they're going to go by. And you know, there were cars going by you at better than 150 miles an hour.
Right.
Bobby Unser, especially when he wasn't making pit stops and just driving through. But yeah, that I was on my toes down there, and then Sid started bringing me up into the booth on qualifying days, and we were going to split the race in 1977. He'd start it, and I would end it, and that would be the handoff.
Ah, interesting. Gotcha. And that was unfortunately the time when Sid passed.
Yeah.
But you know, you mentioned how you got started in that North Pit, and I remember, and I love this story in your book about how Sid had asked you to interview Evel Knievel down there,
Yeah.
and he totally busted you. Exactly.
Yep.
Tell that one just a little bit, because that cracked me up. It made me smile when I read it again.
Well, he directed me to go interview Evel Knievel, and I don't know why I didn't want to. Maybe I didn't think that he was classy enough, or I'm not sure what my thinking was at the time, but I kind of avoided it. And what I forgot is that Sid's on the 5th floor of the control tower, and he can see me. So I got caught, and I did get lectured for that, but fortunately he understood. And then when I got in that seat, it was amazing to me. I remember telling one of our pit reporters to go interview this guy. It was during the race, a legitimate race interview. And I'm on it, and I look down, and he hasn't moved. And he didn't move for like 5 minutes, and then he calls up and says, "I can't get him. I don't know what's going on." I think, I know what's going on. I've done the same thing.
Right. The eye in the sky has seen it all.
Yeah. Yep.
So one of the cool things I love about you, Paul, aside from all of your history and your knowledge and your skills that you've built up, is that you've built a really great relationship with so many of the best known drivers, and some that even aren't that well known. And part of that is because they trusted you to keep the secrets. So who was probably the first one that you kind of got in with that, okay, now I'm kind of in that circle, I can be trusted?
It would have been Bobby Unser, but of course, yeah, we had kind of a relationship. But then when we started working together, I mean, that was the greatest time going. But it really started there. And if you remember in the book, the introduction was written by Mario, and his first sentence is, "Paul Page is not a rat." And the publisher went nuts. He said, "We can't put a line like that in there." I said, "That's the perfect line." He's really
perfect.
Because he goes on to talk about keeping the secrets and using them only in a mode that they would allow me to use them. For example, they tell me something ahead of the race, "We're trying this. And if it actually works, then you can talk about it." that kind of thing.
I
And
gotcha.
the racing such a tight community, those secrets are pretty important.
Oh yeah, that's under lock and key, like a Brinks truck right there. You
We
can't.
one of the things I worked for a while with Big Naughty, um, as the parts washer and then the radio guy, and this is like in 70, 71.
Well, I remember that because you brought like the military radios because they wanted radios, and they put you in charge of
Yeah,
that.
yeah. And but what happened? I'll make sure I tell this one right. The radio were terrible. They were absolutely horrible, and everybody was cheating with the radios. Like one very very famous 4-time winner had a huge radio with massive power, and it was fun to be a part of that, but it also put me in a position to being a signal guy at a couple of tracks, and one of them was Michigan. And Michigan at that time had a strip of Armco barrier about 25 feet in from the main, well, the D part of the oval. That went away a long time ago, and that may have been one of the scariest things ever, because those cars were, flying, and you're right there.
Yeah.
I've never been in the pits at Indy during the race, obviously, but I can imagine how scary that whole thing is too. Fortunately, because of the radios, we don't have to have pit boards anymore.
Thank God. Yeah, some of those older days were really sketchy, to put it nicely.
Yeah.
So, Paul, you've been a part of some of the greatest radio and TV calls in 500 history. Obviously, we could talk about the finish with John Cock and Mears. We can talk about, Little Al. We can talk about all that stuff. Aside from the obvious ones that I think most people know, and you've probably talked about, a bazillion times over the years, is there any that kind of rank right up there that, people don't kind of forget about that really stand out for you?
Stands out for me because what I did was really a non-call. It was on ABC, and you've got Emerson Fittipaldi and Al Unser Jr. just knocking on each other last 10 laps of the race. And I'm thinking about this, and we've been calling it and had a couple of pit reports. And then I think, we're a visual medium. I don't need to talk about those two cars. Everybody knows what's going on there. So all I would do was every lap, I might say, so many miles to go or so many laps to go, and then shut up until then, when finally Little Al and Fittipaldi get together. Then I'm going crazy, but I was pretty proud of staying out of it. And after that, I paid more attention to that, to just letting the show breathe. We had really good microphone coverage by then, and before we just had what they called a roar mic hung out somewhere. But so I started deliberately leaving holes, just so, like at Road America going into turn one, you can hear the gearing going down and stuff like that.
Right. No, that's awesome. So, of course, you had some challenges, let's say, when you had, like Bobby in the TV booth with you and Sam, and, they would contradict each other. And I know there was some shenanigans there with Bobby, because Bobby was well known for that. But any other like specific challenges where you're like, holy smokes, this has the potential to be a shit show. I need to do something here.
I had two challenges that were more generic. One was Sam, God bless him, who has Parkinson, but he still goes over to Lime Rock near his home and drives a race car. And he's done some beautiful paintings lately.
Yes, he has. I've seen some of those.
Sam, he's an aristocrat. He's an architect. He's a painter. He's a great wordsmith. And he would sit to my left, and he'd come in every race day, and he had a stack of like 5x7 cards. It might have been, a lot.
Wow.
And he did that 2 years in a row. And I said at the end of the second year, I said, Sam, that's slowing you down. You really ought not to do that, because you're spending time looking through the cards. So the next year he showed up and he had his cards. So about lap 3, I reached over, picked up his cards, and I threw them all the way to the other end of the booth. And he had his best race ever. And he said that afterwards. He said, you're right about that. Bobby, on the other hand, Bobby didn't like to memorize on-camera opens. He preferred to have a teleprompter. Well, we didn't have teleprompters for the different locations that we were. And so Bobby took the file folders and taped them together and took a marker and wrote his on-camera open on those file folders. And again, that's not a good idea, Bobby. There's a bunch of reasons that you should not do that, not the least of which is you're looking off camera the whole time. He still kept at it. So I worked it out with a stage manager. We were at Michigan. We're up on the roof of the grandstand there. And we're like 3 minutes to air. And I go, Bobby, come on, we're on. And paused a little bit and then said, hello, I'm Paul Page, we're here. And Bobby Unser is here too, whatever the lead was. Sure. And he started reading his card and the stage manager just dropped him, let go of him. They actually blew off the top of the stand and Bobby stopped. He had nothing, And I said, and now, fortunately, that wasn't live, my friend, but that's why you don't use those kind of things. He got it. We didn't see those file folders after that. So, yeah, good moments with those guys. It was so much fun, and some of the others, sense and having the ability to go back and do the radio network for 2 years again, that was huge. And then Mark James and I on the 100th race kind of did what Sid and I were going to do is that I got the race started, and after the first lap, handed it off to Mark James, and we made that transition back. So
that's awesome. That's definitely
neat
like
people.
We said earlier. Yeah, kind of coming full circle. So let me ask you this, Paul, because as you're telling those stories, it made me think about this. As you were honing your skills, as you were kind of coming up and you were getting the opportunities, and as you were telling the story about Bobby and Sam and all those guys, it's like, do you find that, especially when you've got people that aren't necessarily full-time professional guys like you, where it takes them a bit of time to kind of get to that point where they can kind of think more freely and not have to rely on notes or cards or things like that?
Yeah, and I see that a lot. And most of them never actually make that transition. Because when you think about it, we're the only sport that Sunday, the playing field's 2.5 miles long, and any one of 33 competitors could make the move that wins the game at any moment during the race. So you can't get bogged down with stuff like that. But the guys who are coming from what I call stick and ball sports and try and do it, they always seem to have a problem just because they're so used to having a break. I've called football, and you call the play, then your analyst takes over for 45 seconds or so, and you can rest and look around and look at your notes. You look down, look at your notes in the booth at Indy, and probably something's going to happen at that very second.
That's right. Because it seems to me, and I use this analogy when I'm teaching my students and coaching people as well. It seems like I equate it oftentimes to pro football. And I love football, not nearly as much as IndyCar racing, but every year in football, they draft the college players out, right? However, 200 and however many. 9 times out of 10, most of those guys don't make a huge impact the first year. And they say, why is that? Because the game is too fast for them, right? The speed of the college game is different than the speed of the pro game. But by year 2, 3, 4, all of a sudden those guys come into their own. And it seems to me that if you're kind of dedicated to your craft like you were, you kind of get to that point where the game slows down faster. And to your point, some of these guys that come from other disciplines, they have that hard time. It takes them longer, if they ever get it, for the game to slow down to where they can call it live as it's happening. If that makes sense.
You're exactly right with all of that. And most guys that love auto racing and try, they still have trouble. I mean, a lot of them who would have the passion, they really want to be there, but unfortunately the repertorial skills are so different and require so much. Both television and radio, though I started it in radio, I have a button on my console that I push down, it takes me off the air. And in television's case, it puts me on directly to the producer, and in radio's case, it put me on to all the announcers around the track. And so those are the little things you don't know about that you're using, and when you're planning, you're mentioning this, give me this shot, do this. And that by itself, listening to something else in your ear, which is a big television thing anyway, that, be yelling in your ear when you're trying to do a call of something.
Sure.
It's those kind of skills too are something that unfortunately you really only can do when you get up to those levels, because they don't exist elsewhere.
There's no simulator for that, is there?
No, there is not. I've tried to, excuse me, I've tried to train, and I think successfully have trained a number of announcers to that, to the ability to perform at the network level. And I'm kind of proud of that. But and they always seem kind of surprised when some of the exercises that I give them, they talk them into, why am I doing that? You'll see. It'll come up.
Right. It'll come to you.
Mm-hmm.
So I know we're kind of getting close to practice time here at the Speedway, and I don't want to take up too much of your time, but as we get close to the finish here, Paul, you've had so many incredible relationships and stories and experiences. Like I said at the opening of our interview, it's like you will forget more than I will ever know about that place. But there's got to be a few really special memories, whether it's friendships, pieces of memorabilia, things that people have given you, or interactions or friendships that have lasted the test of time. Have you got any in particular that are really you hold near and dear to your heart from all these years?
Well, obviously Bobby. We had more fun together, and he'd do outrageous things. And so I was the straight man for all of his outrageous things. I loved the guy. Hunter Jr. I was, like so many people, worried when he went through his trials and his problems, but he got himself out of it. I consider him a fairly close friend. He and Bobby and I and Al and Rick Mears used to go snowmobiling together in January up at Eagle River, Wisconsin, or Valcourt, Canada. Let's see, there's so many.
There'd be a show in and of itself.
Yeah, it might be. Racing, as you know, it's a community. It's a family. And whatever, if it's the group of Formula Ford guys or the group of IndyCar guys, we're all in it together. We help one another. And we get very, very close to one another. I remember one instance, we were coming back from Ontario Speedway, and it was on then TWA, and we had to make a stop in St. Louis before we came on to Indianapolis, and we had a layover. Well, on that flight, I came down with a flu, and I was totally gone. But some of the other folks on the crew, our community, our family, just took control and made sure that I got home okay. So that's who we are.
And at the end of the day, Paul, I think you'll agree with me on this. I don't care what industry it is, whether you're running a multinational corporation, a small mom and pop restaurant, or the IndyCar community. At the end of the day, it always comes down to the people anyway.
Yeah, I get one of them that I'm proud of this friendship was with Nigel Mansell. And he wrote something nice for the introductions in the book, but Nigel and I actually had a lot of fun together. He'd invite me up to his house when he lived in Clearwater, and there's a great story here. Nigel had kind of been stabbing me when he saw a video of me driving the Porsche IndyCar at the Nürburgring, though I think I didn't have any reason to apologize. When you look down, then they had the dash set up for speed. You look down, you realize you're going into a turn at 185 miles an hour, that first turn here. But so Nigel and I, we're at Barber, and I'm going to induct him into the Auto Racing Hall of Fame down there. And they did a lot of nice things for us leading up to it. And one of the things they did was take us out to Barber, which was not an IndyCar track yet. And the Porsche guy said, here, we've got some class there in the classroom right now, take these and go. And so we did. And they said, but, keep it down. So we kept it down until we were out of sight. We get down in that turn one complex, and then we hit it. And then when we knew we were coming back into view, we slowed down again. And, at one point, at one of the right-handers, I decided that I could actually pass the world driving champion. And I got inside him, and I'm looking over at him, and I see he's looking at me with kind of a smile. And then I realized I so totally overdrove the turn that I just go sliding straight off into the gravel, and he just drives on by. Well, he gets off in the gravel later by himself. So we pull up in these cars, and we're driving slow, like they asked us. And we come to a stop in the pits, and we hit the brakes, and all the pea gravel comes falling out from under the car. So now we are, we're going to be punished. And the Porsche class there, they were in the classroom, and our punishment was to go say hello to them, which was no punishment at all.
Sure.
But can you imagine what those guys actually felt when Nigel Mansell walks through the door in that classroom and talks to them for about a half an hour? Yeah. So I enjoyed that relationship a lot too.
I'm glad you brought that up about Porsche, because I was going to ask you about your Porsche driving, and wow, you got to drive the Porsche Indy car on the Nürburgring. Yep. How amazing is that?
Yeah, it was fun. It was really a lot of fun. They ran a steering, throttle, and brake trace for us, and then they had your trace, when they give it to you, would be on like an acetate. And they had Teo Fabi's trace on a solid piece of paper. And so you could lay yours over Teo and see where you were doing what. Mine was a little bit longer than his was.
Sure.
And it amazed me that I'd always kind of ramped up the power, and he just goes straight up to where he wants the throttle, and he knows where it's going to go. He doesn't need to ramp it. So that was a huge time. And then the next day they took us over to Weishaupt, and we got to drive every car in the Porsche line at the little test track there at Weishaupt too. So yeah, that was pretty fun.
How amazing. That Nigel Mansell. Yeah, you've lived quite the life there, my friend. So on the flip side, though, there's had to have been more than one. I'm sure there's been more than one driver, team owner, whatever it is, that was more than a little difficult to interview, to talk to, whatever. Who's probably been the toughest nut for you to talk to? That's been the most difficult.
Well, I guess I was lucky that Roger Penske, Pat Patrick, they were all very good to me. When Ganassi goes over to a team ownership after driving, he's always nice. And his dad, God bless him, when he's alive, was just the nicest guy in the world. He'd take pictures of everybody all the time. And then a week later in the mail, you get a folder of pictures that he took of you. And but tough ones. Well, Foyt's tough. Now, some people just kind of hit it off very well with him. Robin Miller would have been the greatest example, though Robin had a wrench or two thrown at him.
I'm sure he did.
But I never really clicked with AJ. I mean, we're friendly, we converse, I visit him in the hospital, but we never had that snappy thing that like I had with Bobby.
Sure, that makes sense. Interesting.
He didn't deny anything. I mean, anything I needed, they promptly took care of. But always kind of wanted that to go a little better.
Gotcha. Interesting. All right, my friend, as we roll into the white flag lap here, because I know we both got commitments this afternoon, talking about coming back to this year's Indy 500, so many strong teams in this series. And I've had this conversation with several folks before, and I think you'll probably agree as well. The depth of talent in the IndyCar series these days is probably the best that it has ever been.
Oh, so absolutely.
With that, I mean, go ahead.
Most of my time as a broadcaster at the Speedway, I could pick out one of 3 or 4 guys that I knew was going to win, and it was always in the front couple of rows, unless somebody like Rutherford screwed it up and came from the back to win. You can't do that today. I mean, you just throw a dart at the field you got your little board up on the wall. They are all so good.
That's true.
and the young ones, especially, I call them the young ones, the Paulos, the Colton Hertas,
The VKs,
Rossi,
yeah.
that whole group is just, they do things with race cars that are impossible to do.
Right.
Like, look at Colton Herta puts an Indy car in a four-wheel drift at the Grand Prix.
That's right.
And you look at the onboard camera, and his hands are so incredibly fast. Just they're so good. And you're going to ask me, well, who's going to win it? I just feel that question coming.
Well,
And
it's funny though, because we just interviewed Danny Sullivan a couple of weeks ago, and we were having this same conversation, and he said, I don't even think that you could pick one even up to an hour before race time because of that very fact.
Yeah.
So no, I'm gonna let you off the hook on that one, because I agree with you that it's a tough call. And it's interesting because, like you back in the day, you could always count on Penske to be a favorite. You could count on Andretti, you could count on Ganassi. Well, and then after that, there was a fair drop off. But now you've got, now you've got McLaren, now you've got Dale Coyne running well, you've got all these other teams. And I mean, and the rookies, even down to Malukas and Kirkwood and all those guys are really making a mark. So with that said, sir, anything else
should you have asked that question? I want Elio to win 5, and I want Colton Herta to win. So I got 2 people out of the field.
Fair point.
And I will now catch hell from 31 others.
And that will be our lead in for the show. That'll be the soundbite. No, I agree with you. I would love nothing more than to see Elio win his 5th. That would be fantastic. And I had initially last week, I was really leaning towards Will Power because, I've liked Will for a long time. Obviously, he's very fast. The thing that stood out for me about Will was that he talked, I think it was during practice. Actually, it might have even been during the Grand Prix weekend, how he spent so much time this offseason working on his mental game, right? Because Will's always been kind of the one to kind of lose his cool and get a little bit, hot-headed. And he kind of admitted that maybe have cost him, a couple more 500s or championships. So I was thinking, well, and he's trending in the right way, right? He was on the pole for the Grand Prix. He started 19th at Barber and finished 4th. But now after seeing what Ganassi's done over the last couple of days, I might have to rethink a whole lot of things about this 500. But at the very least, it will be one heck of a race. So to wrap up here, Paul, I think you're probably busier now than you were when you were full-time in the booth. Do you miss not being full-time in the booth anymore?
No. I knew that my day was over in 2015. During the call of 500, I'm looking right at a car that's pitting right in front of me, 9 stories down from the pagoda, and I couldn't connect the name with the number, and that scared me. You cannot do that, especially on the Indy 500, because you're narrating history there. And so I decided at the end of that season that would kind of be the end of it. And because I didn't want to make these guys work so hard. The teams work so hard. You've got to be on your game, and you have a problem like that. It's the only one I've ever had, but it scared me.
Understood. All right, my friend. Well, once again, our great new friend of the show. It's been an honor and a pleasure to have you on today, Paul. Thank you so much. I would love at some point, our schedules notwithstanding, if we could reconnect.
Oh, absolutely.
And we can talk more, but it's been a true pleasure and an honor to have you on this week. Again, ladies and gentlemen, 7th Gear Over at fans, we have had a legend in our midst, a man among men, talking with us here today. Thank you so much, Paul Page.
That's very kind of you. Thank you. Hi to all the fans. Have fun. It's going to be a great race.
It's going to be awesome. Thank you so much.